This is ABC Radio Queensland. Annie Gaffney's my name. On to a much more serious topic now. The Disability Royal Commission has today handed down its seventh and final progress report ahead of the Commission's final report being handed down in September. Now, this report covers the final 6 months of last year and describes a litany of horror stories from people who were variously ignored by the system or abused through it. River Knight is a disability advocate from developing Australian communities. River, always great to have you with us. There's a lot in this progress report. Can you take us through what you see as some of the key takeaways?
Hi, Annie. It's been a marathon effort, I think, for the Royal Commission, where we've hit over 1,500 private sessions. We've hit over 7,000 submissions in the life of the hearing so far. The update report is fantastic. It just tells people in Australia what they've actually been focusing on. So the last 6 months, they've been looking at, how NDIS operates with First Nation communities, especially remote communities. They've been looking at homelessness, especially housing, conditions in detention. We've had a look at violence against people with disability in public places. That's been a big focus of what we've been hearing, as well as, that exploitation and violence between, the community and people from culturally diverse backgrounds, linguistically diverse backgrounds and communities as well. We've also then looked at guardianship and substituted decision making when someone's got someone appointed to make decisions for them. And of course, a bit of a vision around Australia. The thing in the sector, though, that we've got right now is we understand Australia is now seeing this and hearing this because it provides coverage, provides awareness. But the sad part is that a lot of us in this disability sector are reading this report and we're actually nodding our heads and going, you know what? We already know all of this. We already see it. And we're really looking forward to the recommendations that come out of a Royal Commission.
Yes. Now, this Royal Commission has been running for close to 5 years, and the kind of stories we're hearing about in this report have been cropping up all the way along. What impact do you think it has had overall?
Well, one of the big things about having a Royal Commission is it provides a voice and it provides a platform to communicate to the rest of Australia, what's really happening in the disability sector. Because what we find, and one of the big problems that we've seen from the Royal Commission, is that Australia and communities in general need to be aware of what actually goes on. We tend to act with blinkers. And one of the things that's coming out of the Royal Commission is we need to have greater transparency. We need to have, independency when we come to investigating issues of abuse and neglect and when people do the wrong thing. There was some wonderful research that did come out of that Royal Commission work by University of Sydney, Melbourne, the University of Technology in Sydney, that looked at complaint mechanisms for people reporting violence and abuse within those systems. And one of the things that comes out again and again is that there needs to be independent bodies that are independent of service providers, independent of the funding body, that can go in and actually do something about problems when they happen, because the people that they affect are usually the worst at voicing and advocating for themselves because they have support needs and they're in a very vulnerable situation. So one of the recommendations that keeps coming out through the Royal Commission is we need to have independent checks and balances. And that's one thing that NDIS hasn't funded. It's one thing that funding has been taken away from when NDIS rolled out, and it hasn't been replaced. And that's a huge one that we're seeing again and again from the Royal Commission outcomes and some of the things that are coming up in those horror stories that you're hearing.
Just as an aside, what do you make of comments by Peter Dutton today that he would give bipartisan support to any move to reduce NDIS funding to help fund the AUKUS deal in relation to these submarines? I noted that with interest this morning. I haven't heard the government say anything about that. What do you make of those comments?
Well, we tend to need to be aware that we can't do one thing or another thing, So we can't sort of say, look, one thing's really important, so let's take funding from everything else. So defence, very important. NDIS, Medicare, our health system, also incredibly important. So they're things that we don't want to touch. We've heard the horror stories of saying, NDIS is going to be $30 billion, $40 billion. We've only just cracked our actual original budgets for NDIS, which has just passed 20 billion in the last few years after we've had it for 8 years now. So there is no horror story and stress about that budget. A lot of it is the political rhetoric that we hear, but we can't do one or the other. The hearing for the commission, we saw 58% of the people there are people with a disability, and the other half are people who support people with disabilities. So we're hearing voices from the people on the ground. And to take funding away from a program where people aren't overfunded at the moment would be a real shame and a real crime. But what we see when we hear things like Peter Dutton saying this, the great thing about that is it gives us a chance to talk about it, because one of the things that happens in the disability sector, same as aging, is that we don't talk about it until the Paralympics comes on every 4 years and everyone goes, wow, disability. And then between the Paralympics, we don't hear anything. And that's the big thing about the Royal Commission, is that we need to hear more. For example, this week in Australia, we had the largest event in the disability sector in Australian history, and not one media coverage item came across, not one media outlet covered the largest event in Australia's history for the disability sector. And we saw an amazing rebranding and a launch from Paralympics Australia that we're going to have here in Queensland. And we learnt that only 10% of the funding that we actually have for our Olympics goes towards the Paralympics. So we had some amazing things happening in the sector here in Australia this week, and we had zero coverage in the media. And that tells us a lot.
Yeah, it really does. So what are you hoping to see, River, when the final report is handed down in September?
Well, what we like to see in the disability sector is we want people in Australia to go, wow, we didn't realise. We now know. We can now pass this around, and instead of people going, maybe that's just someone over-exaggerating, we can actually say, you know what, here's some statistics, here's some hard evidence of what's happening in the disability sector. So now maybe mums and dads, the voting public, will then go, you know what, NDIS and disability and health and Medicare and all those things, they're actually really important. It's not just someone, loudly crying and trying to make noise. It actually is a real thing. But what we want to see next is the thousands of service providers that I work with around Australia getting together and going, you know what, we actually already have solutions for most of these problems. What we need to do is we need to actually get together with government and actually start putting them in place as a standard thing nationally. Because while all this is happening, we're not sitting here waiting for the Royal Commission to finish. We're actually managing these issues right now. So I can guarantee there's some great minds in some great service providers around Australia that already have solutions to most of these problems.
Really great to get your perspective, River, as always. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
River Knight on ABC Radio Queensland. He's a disability advocate for developing Australian communities. Always such a great voice of reason. It is 5:30. Alex Easton, you look like you want to say something.
I was just talking to Ollie. One of the points River's made the last few times any of us have spoken to him is all of this stuff about, the NDIS is just, it's so expensive and the cost is growing.
Yes.
And that point that he's made is actually it's costing slightly less than it was projected to cost when we first came up with it. It's like, actually, what are we talking about here?
Yes, political rhetoric, as he says, is that what it is? Because I think, when there's when governments get into a deficit situation and they're struggling to balance the books, everyone looks at, it's interesting that they kind of see welfare as a negotiable thing.
It's this thing, like whenever you're talking about welfare or
looking after
spending,
people.
spending on the public. So whether it's NDIS or Medicare or social services or whatever, then it's like, I don't know what we can afford. But then, look, we can get some nuclear subs. Hundreds of billions of dollars? Yeah, no problem. Yeah,
We can do it.
How much is it? Yeah.
And I think people who, are really struggling on very low welfare payments would probably agree that
I think
that's difficult, a bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah. The economist Keynes, I think, had a line saying that governments can afford whatever they can do. So it's like when you're trying to work out what a government or a country can actually financially manage, the question isn't how much money it costs. The question is whether or not they have the actual physical capacity to do it. So if you say we want to upgrade every road in the country all at the same time, we can't do that. Doesn't matter how much it costs.
Yes.
We don't have the bodies to actually physically do it. But if we want to build a road and that costs $1 billion instead of 500 million or $1 million or whatever, that's not really an issue. The money's not the point.